They are not coming, Julian, and that is final. Amelia's voice was not sharp. It was something far worse. It was smooth, polished, and absolute, like a slab of marble being lowered onto a tomb. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of their new apartment, the city lights of the metropolis glittering behind her like a dowry she had personally commanded into existence. Her posture was perfect, a testament to years of ballet lessons and an innate certainty that the world was her stage. She was not arguing. She was delivering a verdict. Julian sat on a packing box, the only piece of furniture in the cavernous living room that felt like his. He looked at her, at the woman he was supposed to marry in 6 weeks, the woman who saw his family not as people, but as a stain to be scrubbed from the pristine canvas of her perfect day. He felt a cold, heavy calm settle in his chest. It was the feeling an engineer gets just before a controlled demolition, a quiet recognition of the inevitable, explosive change to come. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of thoughtful consideration, not stress. Amelia mistook his silence for surrender. It was a mistake she had been making for the entire year she had known him. She saw his quiet demeanor as weakness, his simple tastes as a lack of sophistication, his job as a respectable but ultimately middling architect as a sign that he was lucky to have caught her eye. She saw a man she could mold. She had never once considered that he might be made of something harder than her own ambition. "Darling, you have to see it from my perspective," she continued, her tone softening into a performance of reason. "My father's business partners will be there. The Vanderbilts, the Sinclairs, people who matter. What will they think if your family shows up in their provincial clothes, talking about their farm or whatever it is they do?" She gestured vaguely, as if shooing away a fly. "It's about presenting a united front, an image of success. Our image." Julian's gaze drifted to a sleek, minimalist briefcase leaning against the wall. Inside it was a single encrypted hard drive. It contained blueprints, financial projections, and acquisition records that could purchase and dismantle Amelia's entire world 10 times over. He had brought it home from his office this evening, a quiet premonition guiding his hand. He looked back at her, her face illuminated by the city she believed her family owned a piece of. The irony was a physical taste in his mouth, bitter and metallic. Amelia thought she was closing a door on a minor embarrassment, a small concession she was extracting for the greater good of their social standing. She believed she was trimming the fat, curating her life as she would a guest list or a floral arrangement. She had no idea she was about to light the fuse on a charge that would shatter the very foundations of her carefully constructed reality. Within a week, the name she held so dear, the status she wielded like a weapon, would be rendered meaningless before a power she had been too arrogant, too blind to ever see. We've all felt underestimated, haven't we? We've all had moments where someone judged the book by its cover and found it wanting. If you've ever dreamed of the moment the tables turn, the moment quiet strength reveals itself as the ultimate power, give this story a like and subscribe, because you are about to witness a masterclass in vindication. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. We love to see how far these stories travel. Now back to Julian and Amelia. In a room that had become a silent battlefield, Julian finally spoke, his voice even and measured. "So, to be clear," he said, the words hanging in the air, each one a perfectly placed stone. "My mother, who held 3 jobs to make sure I had books to read, and my father, who taught me the value of building things that last, they are not welcome at our wedding because they might not impress the Sinclairs?" "Don't be so dramatic, Julian," she sighed, turning from the window, her patience wearing thin. "It's not personal. It's practical. It's business." "No, Amelia," he replied, rising slowly from the box. He walked towards the briefcase, his movements deliberate. "It was always personal. You just made it business." He picked up the case, the soft click of the handle echoing in the silent room. It sounded like the cocking of a gun. The first crack in Amelia's perfect world appeared 6 months earlier, under the dim, expensive lighting of a Michelin-starred restaurant called Aperture. It was her choice, of course. She had described it as a place with a discerning clientele, a phrase that was both a promise and a warning. Julian knew what she meant. It was a place designed to make people feel either completely at home or completely out of place, with no middle ground. He had agreed, knowing this meeting was a necessary crucible. He needed to see the full scope of the woman he thought he loved. His parents, Thomas and Mary Hayes, arrived precisely on time. They were the kind of people who believed punctuality was a form of respect. Mary wore a simple navy blue dress she had owned for years but kept in immaculate condition, her silver hair in a neat bun. Her smile was warm and genuine, a stark contrast to the practiced social smiles of the other patrons. Thomas wore a tweed jacket that was slightly worn at the elbows and a pair of well-polished leather shoes. He carried an old, battered leather portfolio under his arm, its corners softened and frayed from decades of use. It looked ancient, a relic from another time, and it seemed to absorb the restaurant's opulent light, refusing to reflect any of it back. Amelia, draped in a silk dress the color of champagne, greeted them with a kiss on each cheek that didn't quite land. Her eyes, however, performed a swift and brutal calculus. Julian watched as she took in his mother's sensible shoes, his father's weathered hands, and the offending portfolio. A flicker of something, disappointment, perhaps even disdain, crossed her features before being replaced by a mask of perfect hospitality. "Thomas, Mary, it is so wonderful to finally meet you," she said, her voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "Julian has told me so much about you." "It's a pleasure to meet the woman who has made our son so happy," Mary replied, her voice soft but clear. She was immune to the restaurant's intimidating atmosphere, her focus solely on the people at the table. The dinner was a masterclass in condescension. Amelia steered the conversation like a warship, firing questions that were thinly veiled judgments. "So, you live in Northwood? How charming. I don't think I've ever been that far out. Is it quiet?" "Very," Thomas said, a gentle smile on his face. "You can see the stars at night. You forget they exist in the city." He placed the worn portfolio on the floor beside his chair, where it rested like a faithful old dog. "And you're in construction, Thomas?" Amelia asked, taking a delicate sip of her wine. "My father is in real estate development. Sterling Properties. Perhaps you've heard of it." The name was dropped onto the table like a platinum credit card. "I have," Thomas said, his expression unreadable. "He builds very tall buildings." "The tallest," Amelia corrected gently. "He's reshaping the skyline." "What sort of things do you build?" Thomas paused, looking at his son with a knowing glance, before turning back to Amelia. "We build things that last," he said simply. "Foundations, structures people can rely on. Schools, hospitals, community centers, the bones of a town." Amelia's smile was polite but vacant. It was clear she considered this work noble in the way one considers charity work noble, something for other lesser people to do. "How admirable," she said, the word landing with all the sincerity of a politician's promise. Throughout the meal, Julian remained mostly silent, an observer at his own life's unfolding drama. He watched Amelia subtly correct his mother's placement of her fork. He heard her explain the concept of a wine flight to his father as if he were a child. With every polite nod from his parents, with every patient smile they offered in the face of her thinly veiled contempt, a quiet, cold fury built within him. It was not the hot anger of a sudden insult, but the slow, pressure-filled anger of a tectonic plate shifting. He felt the sting of her superiority on his parents' behalf, but they seemed untouched by it. They possessed a deep, unshakable sense of self that her judgments couldn't penetrate. He looked at his father, serene and composed, and then at the old leather portfolio by his chair. As a child, Julian had been fascinated by that portfolio. His father had called it his book of ideas. It contained sketches on napkins, complex equations on graph paper, and contracts written on the back of receipts. It held the DNA of his father's life's work. To an outsider, it was a piece of junk. To Julian, it was a symbol of true, unpretentious genius. It was the source of a quiet empire built not on glittering skylines, but on the solid, unshakable ground of integrity and excellence. An empire Amelia was utterly blind to. As the waiter brought the check, a bill that could have covered his parents' mortgage payment for 2 months, Amelia waved her hand dismissively. "My treat, of course." It was not a gesture of generosity, but a declaration of status. On the ride home, Mary was quiet. Thomas finally spoke, his voice gentle. "She's a very polished young woman, son." "Dad, I'm so sorry," Julian began, but his father held up a hand. "Never apologize for who you are or who we are," Thomas said firmly. "A person's character isn't revealed when they're facing adversity. It's revealed when they're given power. We saw her character tonight. The question is, Julian, did you?" Julian looked out the window at the passing city lights, the same lights that framed Amelia in her world of perceived power. "Yes," he said, his voice low. "I saw it perfectly." And in that moment, he knew this was not a misunderstanding to be smoothed over. It was a fundamental divergence of values, a fault line that ran directly under the foundation of their planned future. The demolition had become not just a possibility, but a necessity. The initial tremor at the restaurant was followed by a series of escalating aftershocks, each one further destabilizing the fragile ground on which Julian and Amelia's engagement stood. The wedding planning became Amelia's personal theater of operations, a stage upon which she could perform her superiority. Julian, in her eyes, was relegated to the role of a silent, nodding prop. His opinions were solicited as a courtesy and then promptly ignored. "I was thinking," Julian offered one afternoon, looking over a spreadsheet of potential venues. "My uncle owns a beautiful old barn in the countryside. We could string up lights, have a live band. It would be personal, meaningful." Amelia, who was scrolling through a curated list of five-star hotels and exclusive country clubs on her tablet, didn't even look up. "A barn wedding? Julian, are you being serious?" She finally raised her eyes, a look of theatrical disbelief on her face. "Is that what your family is used to? Darling, this isn't a hoedown. This is a society wedding. My father is expecting to network." She said the word network as if it were a sacrament. The venue was soon decided. The Oak Ridge Country Club, a place where membership fees were equivalent to the GDP of a small nation, and whose board was chaired by a close associate of her father, Richard Sterling. The division became a recurring theme. There were our guests, the wealthy, the powerful, the influential, and there was your family. She spoke of them as two distinct, incompatible species that had to be carefully managed to avoid contaminating the main event. She suggested a separate, more casual pre-wedding brunch for his relatives, so they could celebrate in a way they'd be more comfortable with. The implication was clear. They were not fit for the main stage. The humiliation reached a new, more painful peak during the wedding dress selection. Amelia had booked a private appointment at the city's most exclusive bridal salon. She had invited her mother, Eleanor, a woman whose smile never quite reached her eyes, and two bridesmaids who were near identical copies of Amelia in both fashion and worldview. As a token gesture of inclusion, an olive branch she clearly expected praise for, she invited Julian's mother, Mary. The salon was a hushed temple of white silk and champagne. Mary, in her simple but elegant floral dress, was an island of quiet warmth in a sea of cool indifference. From the moment they arrived, she was systematically excluded. Amelia, Eleanor, and the bridesmaids spoke a coded language of designers Julian had never heard of, Vera Wang, Monique L'Huillier, Marchesa, and discussed budgets in hushed but emphatic tones that made Mary flinch. Mary, "Oh, this one is only 30,000, one bridesmaid chirped, holding up a cloud of tulle. "A bargain, really." Mary, who had lovingly sewn her own wedding dress from a McCall's pattern, simply smiled and said, "It's very beautiful, dear." Amelia, preening in front of a three-way mirror in a dress that cost more than a new car, turned to Mary. "What do you think, Mary? Is it too much?" The question was a performance. She wasn't seeking an opinion. She was seeking adoration. "You look lovely, Amelia," Mary said honestly. "Like a princess." Amelia's smile tightened. A princess. How sweet. She turned to her own mother. "Mother, what's your verdict? Is it powerful enough?" Eleanor adjusted her pearls. "It makes a statement, darling. It says you're not to be trifled with." The rest of the appointment continued in this vein. Mary was a ghost in the room, a silent witness to a ceremony of wealth she was not invited to join. She offered no complaints, her dignity a silent rebuke to their ostentatious display. But Julian, who heard the full report from his mother that evening, delivered without a hint of bitterness, only a quiet sadness, felt a piece of his heart harden. He saw the pain she was trying to hide, the feeling of being made to feel small and insignificant. That night, Julian's quiet patience began to transform into quiet action. He went into his home office, the one room in the apartment that felt truly his, and locked the door. He sat at his desk and made a phone call. "Dad," he said, his voice low and steady, "it's getting worse. The way she's treating Mom, it's unacceptable." On the other end of the line, Thomas Hayes's voice was calm, a deep, resonant sound that always grounded Julian. "I was afraid of this, son. Character is a stubborn thing. It doesn't change just because the circumstances do." "I think it's time," Julian said, the words feeling heavy and final. "I think it's time to prepare the package, the full portfolio." There was a pause. "Are you certain, Julian? This is not a path you can easily turn back from." "I have never been more certain," Julian replied. "She needs to understand. They all do." "All right," Thomas said. "I'll have the documents drawn up and digitized, everything. The Helios acquisitions, the holding companies, the land deeds, the Oak Ridge file in particular." After the call, Julian turned to his computer. He accessed a heavily encrypted private server, the digital heart of his family's silent empire. The interface was clean, professional, and utterly impenetrable. It was the architectural firm he secretly worked for, not as a mid-level employee, but as the vice president of strategic design, second only to his father. His name on the company roster was J.T. Hayes, a deliberate layer of anonymity. He began downloading files, terabytes of data that represented decades of quiet, methodical work. He compiled blueprints of landmark buildings the Sterlings thought were designed by rivals, financial reports of shell corporations that had outbid Sterling properties on prime real estate, and detailed ownership charts that traced back through a dozen intermediaries to one name, Thomas Hayes. He transferred it all to a single, sleek black hard drive, no bigger than a credit card. He slipped the drive into a simple, elegant envelope. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel anger. He felt a profound and heavy sense of responsibility. He was not preparing a weapon for revenge. He was preparing a mirror so large and so clear that Amelia and her family would have no choice but to see their own reflection in it. Stripped of all their comforting illusions, he placed the envelope in his briefcase and locked it. The quiet preparation was complete. The storm was now inevitable. The final irreparable fracture occurred on a Tuesday afternoon, a day of brilliant sunshine that seemed to mock the encroaching darkness in Julian's life. The trigger was, fittingly, the guest list, a document that had become less a list of loved ones and more a strategic ranking of social assets. Amelia had spent a week meticulously arranging the seating chart for the reception at the Oak Ridge Country Club, treating it with the gravity of a military strategist planning an invasion. She unveiled it to Julian with a flourish, the glossy printout spread across the marble island in their kitchen like a battle map. "I think I've finally cracked it," she announced, a triumphant gleam in her eye. "The Sinclairs are at my father's table, of course. The Vanderbilts have their own, near the dance floor. It's perfect." Julian scanned the chart. He found his own parents, his aunts, uncles, and cousins, all 15 of them, clustered together at a single lonely table. Table 42. He traced its location on the grand ballroom map. It was tucked into a far corner, an afterthought, nestled uncomfortably close to the service entrance for the kitchen. The message was not subtle. It was a blaring klaxon of disrespect. "Table 42?" Julian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Next to the kitchen?" "Well, yes," Amelia said, frowning at his tone. "I thought it would be better for them. They'll be able to relax, be themselves. They won't feel the pressure of being surrounded by everyone else. It's more comfortable." "Comfortable," Julian repeated the word, letting it hang in the air. "You mean hidden." For the first time, a flicker of irritation crossed Amelia's face. She was not used to being questioned. "Julian, let's not do this. The seating chart is a delicate ecosystem. One wrong move, and the whole thing collapses. This is the best solution." "No," Julian said, his voice calm but unyielding. He looked her directly in the eye. "The best solution is that my family, the parents of the groom, will sit at the head table. With us, my aunts and uncles will be seated at the tables next to them. They are not an inconvenience to be managed, Amelia. They are my family. The direct challenge startled her. It was as if a piece of the furniture had suddenly voiced an opinion. Her expression hardened, the mask of pleasantness falling away to reveal the cold arrogance beneath. Absolutely not, she snapped. That is not negotiable. The head table is for us, my parents, and my maid of honor, and your best man. That's it. It's for the important people. And my parents are not important? The question, so simple and direct, pushed her over the edge. Her control finally broke, and the words she had been holding back for months came pouring out in a torrent of unfiltered contempt. No, Julian, in this context they are not, don't you get it? They don't fit. Their clothes, the way they talk, their complete lack of sophistication. They will be an embarrassment. My father's associates are coming to this wedding to see a merger of two powerful families, not to watch me marry into a family of farmers and builders who look like they just stepped out of a dusty old photograph. The tirade continued, a list of grievances against his family's very existence. They were too simple, too poor, too rustic. They would ruin the aesthetic. They would lower the tone. They would tarnish the day she had been planning since she was a little girl. This is my one day, Julian, she finished, her chest heaving, her face flushed. My one perfect day. And I will not have it ruined. So I am telling you now, they can come to the church, if they must. But they are not coming to the reception. They are not coming to Oak Ridge. And that, she said, her voice dropping back to that chilling, marble-smooth finality, is final. There it was, the ultimatum, the line drawn not in sand, but in concrete. A profound quiet descended upon the room. The brilliant sunshine poured through the windows, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air, each one a tiny, insignificant world. Julian felt strangely detached, as if he were watching a scene from a movie. He saw a woman so trapped in a prison of her own making that she couldn't see the love and value right in front of her. He didn't feel anger anymore. He felt a deep tectonic sadness, the sadness of a building being condemned. He looked at her, this beautiful broken stranger he had almost married, and all he said was, I see. The quiet simplicity of his response unnerved her more than any shouting match would have. He wasn't fighting. He wasn't pleading. He was accepting. She mistook it for capitulation, a final weary surrender. A faint, triumphant smile touched her lips. She had won. Julian turned without another word and walked into his home office, closing the door softly behind him. The click of the latch was the only sound. He sat at his desk and picked up the phone, his hand steady. He dialed a familiar number. His father answered on the first ring. Thomas Hayes. Dad, Julian said, his voice a low, steady hum. It's me. Julian. Is everything all right? Thomas asked, his paternal instinct sensing the shift in the atmosphere even miles away. Everything is about to be, Julian replied. Let's arrange that family dinner, the one we talked about, at the Sterling residence. I'll make the call. Has it come to that? Thomas asked, his voice laced with sorrow. Yes, Julian said, his eyes landing on the sleek briefcase in the corner. She's just made it necessary. The calm in his voice was the quiet at the heart of a hurricane, the serene, terrifying peace just before the storm makes landfall. The Sterling mansion was not a home. It was a statement, a sprawling neoclassical monument to money, perched on a hill overlooking the city. Every column, every cornice, every pane of glass was designed to communicate one thing: power. Inside, the foyer was a cavern of marble and silence, the air chilled to a precise temperature that discouraged lingering. It was in this opulent mausoleum that Julian had agreed to meet Amelia and her parents, Richard and Eleanor Sterling. Amelia believed he was coming to surrender. When she greeted him at the door, her kiss was proprietary, the gesture of a victor, accepting terms. I'm so glad you've decided to be reasonable, darling, she whispered, guiding him towards the grand sitting room where her parents were waiting, arranged like figures in a royal portrait. Richard Sterling, a man whose face seemed permanently fixed in a mask of shrewd appraisal, rose from a wingback chair. He was tall and silver-haired, radiating an aura of casual inherited dominance. Julian, my boy, he said, clapping Julian on the shoulder, with a force that was more assertion than affection. Glad you came. Amelia was worried, but I told her you were a smart lad. You understand the bigger picture. Eleanor Sterling offered a cool, bloodless smile from her position on a silk-upholstered divan. A wedding can be so stressful, she offered vaguely. It's wise to choose one's battles. They were a united front of condescending power, so secure in their position that they felt no need to be subtle. They believed they were graciously allowing Julian to save face, to accept the reality of his station relative to theirs. Julian, in his simple, well-tailored dark suit, remained unnervingly calm. He let them talk. He listened as Richard pontificated about the importance of brand alignment in marriage, comparing the union to a corporate merger where one party was clearly the senior partner. He listened as Amelia outlined her revised, family-free vision for the reception. He absorbed it all, his face a neutral mask, his patience a deep, unfillable well. When they had finally exhausted their pronouncements, a self-satisfied silence settled over the room. Richard leaned back, steepling his fingers. So, we're all in agreement then. A pragmatic solution for a delicate situation. It was then that Julian spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room's heavy atmosphere with the precision of a scalpel. I've been listening, he began, his gaze moving from Richard to Eleanor, and finally settling on Amelia. To all of you, for months. I've been listening at dinners, during planning sessions, in our own home, and I've been keeping a list. Amelia's smile faltered. A list? What are you talking about, Julian? A list of grievances, Julian said, his voice still level, devoid of overt anger. He was not a prosecutor yelling at a jury. He was a coroner, calmly detailing the cause of death. Let's start with our first dinner, Amelia. At Aperture. You asked my father if his construction business was like your father's, the same way one might ask if a rowboat is like a battleship. You implied his life's work was a quaint little hobby. He didn't wait for a response. Then there was the dress fitting. You invited my mother, not to include her, but to use her as a backdrop, to make your own wealth shine brighter against her simplicity. You and your mother discussed a $30,000 dress as a bargain in front of a woman who sewed her own, making her feel like a pauper in a palace. Eleanor shifted uncomfortably on the divan. Now, that's not fair. Julian's eyes flicked to her, and she fell silent. And you, Richard, your speech just now about brand alignment, as if my family is some failing subsidiary you're being forced to absorb. You see this marriage not as a union of people, but an acquisition of an asset you deem slightly below market value. He saved his final volley for Amelia. And tonight, table 42. You didn't place my family by the kitchen to make them comfortable. You hid them because you are ashamed of them. And in being ashamed of them, Amelia, you are ashamed of me. You just told me, in no uncertain terms, that the people who gave me life, who shaped my character, who are the very bedrock of who I am, are not worthy to attend our wedding celebration. He paused, letting the weight of his words fill the cavernous room. You see this as a delicate situation that requires a pragmatic solution. You are mistaken. This is a character test, and you have all spectacularly failed. A stunned silence followed. The Sterlings stared at him, mouths slightly agape. They had never been spoken to this way, with such calm, devastating clarity. It was as if their butler had suddenly started critiquing their ethics. Just as Richard began to sputter a response, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, the deep, sonorous chime of the doorbell echoed through the foyer. A moment later, the butler, a man named Giles, who had been with the family for 30 years, appeared at the doorway, his expression uncharacteristically flustered. "Pardon the interruption, Mr. Sterling," Giles said, his voice hushed, "but a Mr. Thomas Hayes is here to see you. And a Mrs. Hayes. They say they have an appointment." Amelia's eyes widened in horror. "Here? You brought them here?" she hissed at Julian. "Is this some kind of ambush? You brought your father to plead your case for you?" Richard Sterling let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "Oh, this is rich. The boy brings his rustic father to the big city to fight his battles. What are you going to do, Mr. Hayes? Offer to build me a new garden shed if I let your family come to the party?" Julian simply smiled, a faint, sad smile. "No," he said, as his parents were shown into the room. "I brought him here to present his wedding gift." Thomas and Mary Hayes entered the room, and the atmosphere immediately shifted. They were dressed just as they had been at the restaurant. Mary in her simple, elegant dress, Thomas in his comfortable tweed jacket. They radiated a quiet dignity that felt more solid and real than all the marble and silk in the Sterling mansion combined. Thomas held the same old battered leather portfolio under his arm. Richard Sterling rose, his posture a study in aggressive territoriality. "I think you've got a great deal of nerve, showing up at my home uninvited," he boomed. Thomas Hayes did not look at Richard. He did not look at Eleanor or Amelia. His eyes were fixed on his son. "Julian," he said, his voice calm and steady. "Are you sure about this? Once we open this portfolio, there's no going back. Relationships will be permanently altered." Julian met his father's gaze. The love and respect that passed between them was a silent, powerful current in the room. "I'm sure, Dad," Julian said softly. "They've made it clear what they value. It's time they understood what value really is." With a nod, Thomas stepped forward to the grand, polished mahogany coffee table that sat like an altar in the center of the room. He placed the worn, scarred leather portfolio upon its gleaming surface. The contrast was startling. The humble, time-worn object against the symbol of sterile, modern wealth. With deliberate, unhurried movements, he unfastened the two brass clasps, which clicked open with a sound that seemed to echo in the dead silence. He did not pull out wads of cash or a checkbook. Instead, he withdrew a series of beautifully bound documents, their pages filled with intricate designs and dense legal text. He also produced a single, heavy, ornate key, forged from a dark burnished metal. He took the top document, a thick portfolio bound in dark blue leather, and slid it across the mahogany surface towards Richard Sterling. "I believe you're familiar with the Blackwood Tower project, Richard," Thomas said, his voice even. "The new 50-story commercial skyscraper downtown. Your firm put in a very aggressive bid for the land acquisition last quarter." Richard's eyes narrowed. "We were outbid by some ghost corporation from Delaware. A shell company. Helios. No one knows who they are." "I am Helios," Thomas said simply. "Or rather, Helios Construction is the primary subsidiary of my firm, Hayes Foundational Structures. We acquired that land 3 months ago. Your bid, as I recall, was insufficient. We broke ground last month." Richard snatched the document. His hands, usually so steady, trembled as he flipped through the pages. He saw the official deeds, the city permits, the financial statements, all bearing the name Helios, and on the final signature page, the crisp, clear signature of Thomas Hayes. His face went from crimson to a pale, ashen gray. Thomas didn't wait for the reality to sink in. He took a second file, this one detailing the financials and ownership structure of a familiar establishment, and pushed it across the table. "And the venue for the wedding, the Oak Ridge Country Club, a lovely place. My wife and I were so taken with it when Julian described it that we decided to invest. We acquired a controlling interest in the club's parent hospitality group last week. The general manager, your friend Bob Covington, now reports to an executive board, which I chair." Amelia made a small, choking sound. The entire foundation of her social power, the club that was the epicenter of her world, was now owned by the man she had deemed unfit to enter it. Finally, Thomas picked up the ornate, heavy key. He didn't slide it towards Richard. He pushed it gently across the table until it rested in front of Julian. "And this," he said, his voice softening as he spoke to his son, "is our wedding gift to you. I know you and Amelia were looking at apartments in the Azure Building. A fine building. We financed its construction a decade ago. I thought the penthouse might be more suitable for you. This is the key. We had the title transferred into your name this morning, Julian. Your name alone. The key lay on the polished wood, a dark, solid object radiating a power that made all the glittering chandeliers and silver picture frames in the room look like cheap trinkles. The air was thick with the sound of a world breaking. The quiet, rustic builder and his humble wife were not just wealthy. They were a force of nature, a silent, invisible hand that had been shaping the very city the Sterlings thought they ruled. And in their boundless arrogance, they had not only insulted them, they had declared war on them, without ever realizing they were hopelessly outgunned. The silence that followed Thomas Hayes's revelations was not merely an absence of sound. It was a physical presence, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all thought. It was the sound of an entire worldview collapsing in on itself. Richard Sterling stood frozen, his hands still resting on the Helios construction portfolio, his face a mask of gray, slack-jawed disbelief. The architect of skylines had just been shown a blueprint of a power so vast and so silent it made his own noisy empire look like a child's sandcastle. Amelia was the epicenter of this implosion. Her mind, which usually moved with the quick, decisive clicks of a calculator, had simply ceased to function. The sequence of events was impossible. The man in the worn tweed jacket, the man she had pitied for his simplicity, owned the country club she used as a social weapon. The woman she had dismissed as a provincial nobody was now, effectively, her landlord 100 times over. The poor family she had tried to banish was, in fact, so wealthy that they could buy and sell her own family without noticing the transaction fee. The cognitive dissonance was a physical blow. "This is a joke," she stammered, the words catching in her throat. It wasn't a question, but a desperate plea for it to be true, a trick, some kind of elaborate prank. But Richard knew better. He was a man who understood the brutal language of money and power. He had seen the documents. He recognized the signatures of law firms and financial institutions. He had lost the Blackwood Tower bid. He knew the name Helios. The pieces were snapping into place with horrifying speed and clarity. The arrogance drained from his face, replaced by the raw, primal terror of an apex predator suddenly finding itself prey. His transformation was instantaneous and absolute. "Thomas, Mr. Hayes," he began, his voice a hoarse, unfamiliar croak. He took a step forward, his hands raised in a gesture of supplication. "There has been a truly terrible misunderstanding. I had no idea. If I had known who you were—" "That is precisely the problem, Richard," Thomas said, his voice cutting through Richard's fawning. "You treat people based on who you think they are, not based on their character. You showed us your character. We are merely returning the favor." Amelia, finally grasping the cataclysmic scale of her miscalculation, turned to Julian. The shock was now curdling into a frantic, desperate panic. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of remorse. They were tears of pure, unadulterated fear. The fear of having lost. "Julian," she cried, her voice breaking. She reached for his hand, but he let it drop. "Darling, please, I didn't mean any of it. I was just stressed. You know how weddings make me. I was being foolish. It was a mistake." Julian looked at her, and for the first time, she saw him with absolute clarity. She saw the quiet strength she had mistaken for weakness, the profound intelligence she had mistaken for simplicity, and the deep, unshakable integrity she had never even thought to look for. The love that had once been in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, piercing appraisal that chilled her to the bone. He was no longer the man she thought she was molding. He was the man who was about to decide her fate. He didn't respond to her pleas. He turned instead to his parents. He walked to his mother and gently took her hand. "Mom," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he had suppressed for months. "I am so sorry. I am sorry I ever put you in a position to be judged by these people. I am sorry I let this go on for as long as it did." Mary Hayes, who had stood by her husband's side with a quiet, regal composure, squeezed her son's hand. She then looked past him, her gaze landing on Richard and Eleanor Sterling. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it resonated with a moral authority that silenced the entire room. "We are proud of our son, Mr. Sterling," she said. "We raised him to believe that a person's worth is measured by the strength of their convictions and the kindness in their heart. We taught him to value character, not currency. It seems we simply have different definitions of wealth." The simple, elegant statement landed like a perfectly placed dagger, piercing the heart of their shallow world. Eleanor flinched as if struck. Finally, Julian turned back to face Amelia. The power dynamic in the room had not just shifted, it had inverted with the force of a geological event. The Sterlings, who had believed themselves to be on a mountaintop, were now at the bottom of a canyon, looking up. "The wedding," Julian said, his voice now holding the cold finality she had once used against him, as you planned it, is canceled." "No," Amelia wailed, the sound raw and desperate. She lunged forward, grabbing his arm. "No, Julian, please. We can fix this. We can change everything. Your family can sit wherever they want. We can have the wedding you wanted, the barn wedding. I don't care about the Sinclairs. I don't care about any of it. I only care about you." Julian gently but firmly detached her hand from his arm. "It was never about where they sat, Amelia," he said, shaking his head slowly. "It was never about the barn or the country club. It was about the fact that you thought their position at a table determined their worth. It was about the fact that you were ashamed of where I come from. And if you are ashamed of my past, you cannot be a part of my future." He then looked past her to Richard, whose face was a mess of calculations and frantic damage control. "And you," Julian said, his voice hardening slightly, "you like to talk about brand alignment. Let's talk about that. Your brand is built on a perception of power, a reputation for being the biggest player in the city, a perception that is now extremely vulnerable. I wonder what your investors would think if they knew that Helios Construction, the new dominant force in this city's development, views Sterling Properties as a hostile and morally bankrupt entity." The threat was not even veiled. It was a declaration of war, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. Richard Sterling, the titan of industry, looked at this young architect he had dismissed as a boy, and for the first time in his life, he felt true abject fear. The demolition was complete. All that was left was the dust and the silence. Julian did not linger to survey the wreckage. There was no triumph in his expression, only a deep, resonant sorrow for what had been lost and what could never be. He gave a slight nod to his parents, a silent signal that their work there was done. Thomas calmly gathered the documents from the mahogany table, placing them back into the worn leather portfolio with the same care he had taken removing them. The clasps clicked shut, sealing the fate of the Sterling family within. Without another word, the Hayes family turned and walked out of the sitting room, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence. They left the Sterlings standing amidst the ruins of their arrogance, a tableau of shock and devastation. Amelia had sunk to her knees, her sobs the only sound in the opulent prison she had built for herself. Richard stood frozen, staring at the empty space where the portfolio had been, the ghost of its power seeming to burn into the polished wood. Eleanor had collapsed onto the divan, her hand pressed to her chest, the perfect hostess finally confronted with a guest she could not manage. The days that followed were a blur of fallout for the Sterlings. The news of the incident, as it came to be known in hushed whispers among the city's elite, spread like wildfire. The story had too many irresistible elements: the secret billionaire, the arrogant fiancé, the spectacular downfall. Richard Sterling, a man who traded on reputation, found his suddenly shredded. Business partners became wary, investors grew nervous. The name Helios, once an anonymous ghost, was now on everyone's lips, and its unspoken rivalry with Sterling Properties cast a long, dark shadow over Richard's company. He was forced into a humiliating position, making frantic calls to contacts, trying to mitigate the damage, only to find that doors that had always been open were now politely but firmly closed. The power he had worshipped was a fickle god, and it had abandoned him. For Amelia, the aftermath was a descent into a personal hell. The wedding was, of course, officially canceled. The notifications sent out cited irreconcilable differences, a phrase so bland it couldn't possibly contain the epic scope of her failure. Her friends, the same ones she had been so desperate to impress, treated her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. Some, the more pragmatic ones, quietly distanced themselves, recognizing that her social currency had just plummeted to zero. She had gambled everything on status, and in a single evening she had lost it all. She was no longer Amelia Sterling, the coveted heiress. She was the woman who had fumbled a dynasty. 1 week after that fateful evening, Julian was packing the last of his things from the apartment they were supposed to share. He was moving into a smaller place across town, one he had paid for himself long before his father's gift of the penthouse. It was stylish but modest, filled with books and architectural drawings, a space that reflected his true self. The penthouse key sat on his desk, untouched. It felt like a prize from a victory he had never wanted to win. The doorbell rang. It was Amelia. She stood in the hallway, looking smaller and more fragile than he had ever seen her. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by simple jeans and a sweater. Her face was pale and tear-streaked, her eyes puffy. All the artifice had been stripped away. She was unscripted, unarmed, and utterly broken. "Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Can I come in?" He hesitated, then stepped aside. She walked into the half-empty living room, littered with packing boxes. The sight seemed to wound her further. "You're really leaving," she stated the obvious. "I am," he confirmed. She stood in the middle of the room, wringing her hands. "I've been doing a lot of thinking this week," she began, her voice trembling. "Or maybe for the first time I've actually been thinking at all. I've replayed that night, that dinner, everything, over and over in my head." She looked at him, and for the first time, he saw not fear or panic in her eyes, but a flicker of genuine, painful self-awareness. "There's no excuse for how I behaved, she said, the words coming out in a rush. It was monstrous. I was a monster. All my life, I was taught that what you have is who you are, that your value is determined by your net worth, your social standing, the names of the people you know. I was so afraid of not being perfect, of not living up to my father's expectations, of being seen as less than, that I became a person I don't even recognize." She took a shaky breath. "But that's not the whole truth. The truth is, I do love you, Julian. I loved your calm, loved your quietness. I think maybe it scared me. It was a strength I didn't understand. So I tried to change it, to make it fit into my world. I was wrong. I was so wrong. I got lost. And I am so sorry." The apology was raw, real, and devoid of manipulation. It was the sound of a person hitting rock bottom and finally seeing the world from the ground up. This was the moment of Julian's true moral test. Revenge would have been to slam the door in her face. Cruelty would have been to remind her of all she had lost. But his goal had never been destruction. It had been justice. And justice sometimes includes the possibility of redemption. He looked at her for a long time, the silence stretching between them. "I believe you're sorry, Amelia," he said finally, his voice gentle but firm. "But love isn't enough. It can't be. Respect is the foundation of any relationship, and you dynamited that foundation. A building doesn't become sound again just because you apologize to the rubble." Hope flickered in her eyes, fragile but present. "But you can rebuild," she whispered. "Foundations can be laid again. Your father taught you that." "Yes," Julian agreed, "but it requires starting from scratch. And the person doing the building has to be different." He took a step closer, not in intimacy, but to make his point with clarity. "If we are ever to have a future, you need to build it back, brick by brick. And you can't use your father's money or my family's influence to do it. You need to find out who Amelia is without the sterling name. You need to build a character that is as strong as the structures my father builds." He told her his own plans. "I'm moving to Chicago for a year, maybe 2. I'm overseeing the Blackwood Tower project for my father. It's time for me to step out of the shadows." He paused, letting the finality of it sink in. "The door is not closed forever, Amelia, but for the first time in your life, you are the one who has to do the work to walk through it. You have to earn your own key." He looked at the penthouse key on his desk, then back at her. The message was clear. The path to him was not through wealth, but through worth. 1 year later, the Chicago skyline glittered outside the panoramic windows of the Blackwood Tower's penthouse office. Julian stood on the balcony, a phone pressed to his ear, the wind whipping gently at his hair. The building was a marvel of engineering and design, a testament to the Hayes family's vision. It was his project, his triumph, and he had poured his heart into it. "No, Mom, the gala was fine," he said, a warm smile on his face. "A lot of people in suits. You and Dad would have hated it." He laughed. "Yes, I'm eating. I'll be home for Thanksgiving. I promise." The conversation was easy, loving, built on a foundation of unshakable mutual respect. He was happy, at peace, a man who knew his own value, and was surrounded by people who had always known it too. The world had continued to turn. Sterling Properties, humbled and wounded, had survived, but it was a shadow of its former self. Richard Sterling had been forced to learn a new, painful vocabulary: partnership, compromise, humility. The rumors of the Helios incident, had cemented his reputation, not as a titan, but as a man who had made a catastrophic error in judgment. And Amelia? The narrator's voice would tell us that she had taken Julian's words not as a challenge, but as a lifeline. She had walked away from the ruins of her old life. She moved out of her parents' mansion and into a small, one-bedroom apartment in a less fashionable part of the city. She cut herself off from her father's allowance, a move that shocked him more than the loss of the Blackwood deal. Using her long-neglected degree in art history, she had found a job at a small, independent art gallery, earning a modest salary. For the first time in her life, she paid her own rent, bought her own groceries, and learned the quiet satisfaction of self-sufficiency. She didn't call or text Julian. Instead, she wrote him letters, long, handwritten letters on simple stationery. They weren't pleas for him to come back. They were chronicles of her journey. She wrote about the artists she was discovering, the challenge of living on a budget, the strange joy of being anonymous. She wrote about her parents, how she was trying to build a new, more honest relationship with them. She was not describing her penance. She was documenting her rebirth. Back on the balcony, Julian ended the call with his mother. He walked back inside his office and looked at a small framed photograph on his desk. It was of him and Amelia, taken a month after they met, laughing on a park bench. It was from a time before the wedding plans, before the weight of wealth and status had crushed them. Next to the photo was a small stack of letters. The latest one just arrived that day. He picked it up. He recognized her handwriting, which had become less of a perfect practiced script and more of a passionate, hurried scrawl. He opened the envelope. We don't see him read the whole letter, but we see his expression as he does. The cool, guarded appraisal in his eyes softens. The sadness that had lingered for so long begins to recede, replaced by something new. It wasn't complete forgiveness, not yet, but it was the unmistakable glimmer of hope, the possibility that a foundation, if built with new materials and an honest heart, could one day be strong enough to build a future upon. The story closes not on an ending, but on a new beginning, earned not through a gift, but through genuine, painful, and beautiful change. True wealth is not what you have, but who you are. It is measured not in dollars, but in dignity, not in assets, but in integrity. Amelia Sterling learned that lesson in the most painful way imaginable, by losing everything she thought was important, only to find what truly was. Julian and his family, on the other hand, never had any doubt. They had always known that the strongest foundations are the ones that cannot be seen. What do you think Julian should do? Does Amelia, after her year of transformation, deserve a second chance to build a new life with him? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe for more stories that remind us all that character is the only currency that truly matters in the end. Thank you for watching.